October 1946. Over 6,000 Germans vanished overnight in a secret Soviet operation. Families torn from their homes, transported to isolated facilities, cut off from the world they knew. Their mission? Replicate a weapon that could change history. Living in luxury while trapped behind Soviet walls. What they built would launch humanity into space. But first, they had to survive their new master's ambitions. The Midnight Operation. It was just past midnight when the knock came. German families, still asleep in their beds, had no idea their lives were about to change forever. Soviet soldiers moved through the occupied zone like shadows, going door to door with a single mission. Engineers, scientists, technicians, anyone who had worked on Germany's secret rocket program were being taken. No explanations, no choices. Over 2,500 specialists were rounded up in a matter of hours, but they weren't alone. The Soviets took their families too, wives, children, parents, more than 6,000 people in total. By dawn, trains were already moving east, packed with confused and frightened passengers. They didn't know where they were going, they didn't know why, and they had no idea how long they'd be gone. The operation had a code name, Osoaviakhim, and it was about to give the Soviet Union a weapon they desperately needed. But what exactly did the Soviets want from these engineers? The prize, Germany's secret weapon. The answer was simple, the V-2 rocket. During the war, Germany had built the world's first long-range guided missile. It could fly faster than sound, reach the edge of space, and hit targets over 200 miles away. No other country had anything like it. When the war ended, both the Americans and the Soviets raced to capture this technology. The Americans got many of the top scientists, including Wernher von Braun, but the Soviets got something just as valuable: the factories, the blueprints, and thousands of workers who knew how to actually build the rockets. The Soviets didn't just want a few experts, they wanted to move entire research centers from Germany to Russia. Places like Mittelwerk, where the V-2 was mass-produced, were being rebuilt on Soviet soil. The goal wasn't just to copy the rocket, it was to make sure the West never caught up. But where exactly were these Germans being taken? Isolated behind Soviet walls. The trains didn't stop until they reached the heart of the Soviet Union. The Germans were split up and sent to secret locations. Some went to NII-88, a heavily guarded facility just outside Moscow. Others were taken to Gurudomlia Island, a remote spot in the middle of Lake Seliger, surrounded by water and cut off from the outside world. These weren't prison camps, but they weren't far from it. The Germans lived in special compounds. They had their own neighborhoods, their own schools for the children, even their own shops. But they couldn't leave. Armed guards watched the gates. Letters were read before being sent. Contact with the outside world was almost impossible. They were trapped in a strange kind of luxury, and their only job? To teach the Soviets everything they knew about rockets. Day after day, they worked in labs and workshops, rebuilding the V-2 from memory, but with the Soviets treating them well, or just using them. A golden cage. Here's the strange part. Life wasn't bad, at least not compared to most people in the Soviet Union. While average Soviet citizens struggled with food shortages and crowded apartments, the German engineers lived comfortably. They had decent housing, their families were fed regularly, they earned good salaries. Some even had access to luxuries that regular Soviets could only dream of. The Soviets knew they needed these engineers, happy and productive, so they gave them what they needed, except freedom. The Germans couldn't go home, they couldn't travel, they couldn't even talk openly about their work. It was a golden cage, and the Soviets made it clear: cooperate and life stays comfortable, resist and things could get much worse. For many of the engineers, the choice was obvious. They had families to protect, so they worked. And slowly, the Soviets began to unlock the secrets of the V-2. But what exactly were they building? Rebuilding the wonder weapon. The first task was clear: copy the V-2 exactly. The Soviets called it the R-1. It had to be identical down to the smallest bolt. The German engineers worked alongside Soviet scientists, explaining every detail: how the fuel system worked, how the guidance controls functioned, how to keep the rocket stable during flight. It was incredibly complex. The V-2 used liquid fuel, which was difficult and dangerous to handle. It had thousands of parts that all had to work perfectly together. One mistake, and the rocket would blow up on the launch pad. The Germans had spent years perfecting this design. Now they were handing it all over. By 1948, the Soviets successfully launched their first R-1. It worked. The Germans had done their job. But the Soviets weren't satisfied with just copying. They wanted something better, something that could fly farther, hit harder, and give them an edge over the Americans. And that's when everything changed. The Soviets take control. The Germans had taught the Soviets how to build rockets, but now the Soviets wanted to design their own. Enter Sergei Korolev, a brilliant and ambitious Soviet engineer who had his own vision for the future. Korolev respected the Germans' knowledge, but he didn't want to rely on them forever. He began developing new rockets, the R-2 and R-5, that went far beyond the original V-2 design. These rockets could fly farther, carry heavier loads, and were built entirely by Soviet engineers. The Germans were slowly being pushed to the side. They were no longer leading the projects. Instead, they became advisors, teachers, and assistants. Korolev and his team were now in charge. The message was clear. The Soviets didn't need the Germans anymore. They had learned everything they needed to know, and now they were ready to build something the world had never seen before. But what exactly were the Soviets planning to do with these new rockets? The race to space began. The rockets weren't just weapons anymore. They were tickets to space. The work the Germans had done laid the foundation for something far bigger. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. A few years later, they sent Yuri Gagarin into space, the first human to leave Earth's atmosphere. It was a stunning achievement, and it wouldn't have been possible without the German engineers who had been taken in 1946. Their knowledge of liquid-fueled rockets, guidance systems, and large-scale engineering gave the Soviets a head start. While the Americans were still figuring out the basics, the Soviets were already ahead. For a brief moment, the USSR led the space race. The engineers who had been taken from their homes in the middle of the night had helped launch humanity into a new era. But by then, most of them were no longer in the Soviet Union. The return home. By the early 1950s, the Soviets had what they needed. Their own engineers were now capable of designing and building advanced rockets without German help. So, one by one, the Germans were allowed to leave. Between 1950 and 1958, most of the specialists and their families were sent back, but not to the Germany they remembered. They returned to East Germany, now under Soviet control. It was a different world. The war was over, but the country was divided. Some of the engineers adapted. They found jobs in universities or government research centers. Others struggled to rebuild their lives after years of isolation. A few managed to escape to West Germany, hoping for a fresh start. But no matter where they went, they carried the same secret. They had helped build the Soviet rocket program, and that knowledge would follow them for the rest of their lives. But did any of them go on to do something remarkable? Life after the Soviets. Some of the engineers simply disappeared into quiet lives, but others became famous, at least in their own way. In East Germany, several scientists rose to prominent positions in academia and industry. They used their experience to help rebuild the country's scientific community. A few who made it to the West had even more interesting careers. Helmut Grottrup, one of the most important German rocket engineers in the Soviet program, eventually moved to West Germany. There, he did something completely unexpected. He stopped working on rockets altogether. Instead, he turned his attention to electronics and invented the smart card, the technology we now use in credit cards and ID badges. It's a strange twist. A man who helped design weapons that could destroy cities ended up creating something used by billions of people every day. His story shows how the engineers adapted, survived, and moved on. But was it all worth it? The legacy. Looking back, the Midnight Operation in 1946 changed the course of history. The Soviets gained years of progress in rocket technology. They caught up to the Americans, launched the first satellite, and sent the first human into space. None of that would have happened, at least not as quickly, without the German engineers. But the cost was high. Thousands of people were taken from their homes, separated from everything they knew, and forced to work in isolation. Some adapted, some thrived, others never fully recovered. In the end, Operation Osoaviakhim was both a strategic success and a human tragedy. It showed how far a nation would go to win the technology race, and it reminds us that behind every great achievement there are real people, people who had no choice but to survive their new masters' ambitions. Their story is one of resilience, brilliance, and sacrifice, and it's a story the world should never forget. That's what happened when the Soviets took all of Germany's rocket engineers.